Thank you very much. I'm incredibly grateful to M+ and the Design Trust for their support. This fellowship enabled me to make two trips to Portugal, where I spent time in the Colonial Archive and the archives of the University of Lisbon and the University of Porto. I also went to Tokyo to visit the personal archive of the Japanese architect Arata Isozaki. And back in Macau, I spent time in the historical archive here in Macau. But unfortunately, I was not permitted to visit the archives of the Department of Public Works or the Cultural Bureau. But I'm grateful to the librarians and archivists in all of the places I did visit. In particular, I want to thank Professor Ana Neiva at the University of Porto, who made some important introductions. Through her, I was able to speak with Alvaro Siza and his collaborator Antonio Madureira about their time in Macau during the 1980s. I also spoke to Lorenzo and Filomena Vicente, the son and daughter-in-law of Manuela Vicente, to Adalberto Tenreiro, a former collaborator of Vicente, to Carlotta Bruni and Rui Liao, who inherited Vicente's practice, and through them I was able to meet some former collaborators of Vicente in Portugal, Manuel Graça Dias, João Afonso, Pedro Rivara, and João Santa Rita. Antonio Bruno Soares shared his memories of the NAP competition and his own unbuilt proposal for that area. Eduardo Flores kindly shared his memories of working with John Prescott on the ZAP District Master Plan and helped me during my time in Lisbon. I spoke with Mario Neves and Campina Ferreira at MPS about their respective involvements with projects for NAP, ZAP, Area Preta, and Cotai. And Carlos Couto gave me some background information on the projects he supervised during his tenure as government urban planner during the 1980s. I also want to thank Rita Machado, who gave me a copy of her thesis on the planning of NAP, Nuno Rocha at the Cultural Bureau, and my former colleagues at USJ, Francisco Pinheiro, Nuno Soares, and Alvaro Barbosa. And I'm especially grateful to Eduardo Tavares, who provided a huge amount of background information, and I'm delighted that he is here as a discussant to correct my mistakes. So this research arose out of a personal fascination with the special, if not unique, characteristics of Macau, a fascination that dates to my first visit in 1996, when NAP was still under construction. And it was an incredible sight to see an entire new urban district being built out on the water. The level of ambition and the money available to realize that ambition immediately showed me that Macau could be a laboratory for experiments in new types of urban design, literally based on the creation of new land. So due to the absence of existing buildings, or infrastructure, each reclamation is effectively a tabula rasa, a blank slate for reimagining what a city might be. And this obviously includes pragmatic decisions about building volumes and street organization and infrastructural links, but in addition to these quantifiable issues, this also allows thinking about qualitative effects. The atmospheres being generated, the synergistic relationships between different areas, and the types of urban lifestyles being enabled and engendered. But for every project implemented, there are many unbuilt proposals. So my intention has been to delineate an alternative history of Macau, a phantom Macau superimposed on the real Macau that shows what might have been and suggests what is still possible. So I looked at five main areas in Macau: ZAP, which is an acronym for the Zone of Reclamation for the Outer Harbour; NAP, which is an acronym for the new reclamations for the Outer Harbour; Area Preta, Praia Grande, and Cotai. And then finally, I looked at the south part of Hanshin Island for reasons that will become clear. Now, these are mostly late 20th century developments, but the history of ZAP goes back to studies for dredging and reclamation carried out in the late 19th century. The Portuguese engineer Adolfo Loureiro elaborated a series of plans for the inner harbour, but they were always regarded as being too expensive, so not much happened. But significant work on the inner harbour did begin in 1910, was then interrupted by the First World War, and in 1919, Hugo de Lacerda was put in charge of the newly established Office for the Improvement of Macau's Harbour. Now, Lacerda was an interesting man. He associated improvements of the port with improvements in the morals of Macau citizens, particularly with regard to the spread of gambling. The translations from Portuguese are mine, so I apologize for the mistakes. But he was also a visionary. He devised and published a series of proposals for vast, transformative reclamations around Macau, most of which remained unbuilt. But he did approve the creation of the Patan port in the inner harbour, but ran into insurmountable problems with silting and disputes over the extent of Portuguese territorial control. So he decided to abandon the inner harbour, and he initiated a hugely ambitious project to create an outer harbour facing onto the Pearl River Delta. He made a diplomatic agreement with China in 1920, and then work began in 1921. And the Netherlands Harbour Works Company dredged about 5 million cubic meters of sludge from the riverbed, which was transformed into 125 hectares of new land that straightened and widened the eastern seaboard of Macau for the new port facilities. Now, Lacerda and others produced various master plans for this area during the 1920s, which comprised street grids and building lots and parks and so on, but these were never implemented. In fact, post-war maps will always show some kind of street grid on the ZAP area with parks and roundabouts and so on, always slightly different. But the contemporaneous photos show that, will reveal that ZAP remained largely undeveloped right up until the 1980s. The area was appropriated by refugees or immigrants from the mainland who mostly arrived during World War II or Mao's reform campaigns in the 1950s and used the open land for dwellings and vegetable gardens. Now, in 1962, the government set up a planning department comprising 5 architects, notably the young Manuel Vicente. And in 1964, Vicente and Leopoldo de Almeida produced this master plan for the ZAP area in great detail, showing the zoning and morphology of the buildings. It comprises a street layout, and they produced blueprints, a physical model. And what's interesting is in the physical model in the southwest corner, there is a space for a casino hotel development. Now, in 1966, all of the land of ZAP was granted to the entrepreneur Stanley Ho and his new company STDM due to his promise to evict all of the squatters then occupying ZAP and develop it following this master plan. But the entire situation was thrown into turmoil by what's known as the 1-2-3 incident, which was some riots that occurred on the 3rd of December 1966, anti-government protests inspired by the Cultural Revolution, which led to the departure of many Portuguese, including Manuel Vicente, who went on to study at the University of Pennsylvania under Louis Kahn and Robert Venturi. Nonetheless, STDM and Stanley Ho started construction on the Lisboa Hotel and Casino in the appointed area, to the design of the Hong Kong-based architect Eric Kumain. Eric Kumain was born in Shanghai, but his ancestry was Scottish as well as Chinese, and he was a graduate of the London Architecture Academy. So the hotel, the Lisboa Hotel, was completed in 1970, and a few nearby buildings and streets also followed the 1964 master plan, but STDM attempted some revisions to the plan, including a proposal also by Kumain for sports facilities and a bullfighting ring. But for the next few years, ZAP was left mostly undeveloped. Now, Eduardo Tavares was then on the Council for Public Works, and in 1972, he invited the Portuguese architect Thomas Taveira to visit Macau and produce a study for urban planning strategies at a fee of 80,000 patakas, which was a huge sum at that time, of course. Now, the Portuguese Overseas Ministry had been promising to produce a master plan for Macau, but Tavares couldn't wait. So he asked Thomas Taveira, to produce a design, which he submitted in 1976. It included an area for a new university and attempted to decentralize Macau by building new sub-centers in Taipa and Koloan. Tavares also invited Tao Ho, a Hong Kong-based architect who he'd met in the Philippines that year, 1976, to come to Macau and do a renovation of this building we're in right now, the Dom Pedro V Theatre, and make preservation proposals for 12 other historical sites in Macau. Tavares was very actively trying to internationalize Macau's architectural culture. A couple of years after that, he invited the British architect Richard Rogers to come to Macau, showed him around and invited suggestions, but that also led to nothing. Now, in 1979, the British architect based in Hong Kong, John Prescott, produced a new ZAP master plan, which was overseen from his Macau branch office, led by the Portuguese architect Eduardo Lima Soares. And it extended from the Lisboa Hotel all the way to the reservoir, comprised a street layout and regulations for height and density, function and morphology. Most of the buildings were to be enormous commercial podiums supporting residential towers. None of this was implemented, although there was some influence on the areas later allotted for public parks and other facilities such as the Macau Forum. Interestingly, the plan included a proposal for a tunnel through the Gia Hill, which was in fact built in the 1990s. Now, following the arrival in 1981 of the Portuguese architect Carlos Couto to lead the government urban planning department, the Prescott plan was revised by Eduardo Flores and the American architect Peter Seidel, who were both working in Prescott's Macau office. Flores retained the basic street layout, but added some extra streets. He sliced through the enormous podiums with some diagonal secondary pedestrian streets lined with colonnades, set at slight diagonals to the main grid, with some other irregularities in order to preserve existing trees, and he proposed a set of rules about controlled variations in building height. Now, these ideas were rejected by the government, who settled on a more conservative plan, but in any case, none of the ZAP plans were ever gazetted in the official bulletin published by the government, so they had no legal status, and permits could easily be issued for buildings that completely contravened the guidelines. And for example, once it became clear that the shops along the colonnaded pedestrian streets were not commercially successful, at least not at first, the developers simply refused to include them. And in fact, those colonnades were decorative, they weren't structural. So as the reclaimed land continued to settle, the columns were detached from the ground, leaving them visibly hanging from the cantilevered eaves above. Now, by the 1980s, horticulture had mostly disappeared from ZAP, and a few hotels had been constructed by STDM, but they were still trying to relocate the remaining squatters in order to clear all of these sites for development. But even so, STDM held on to the empty sites in anticipation of rising prices, which caused developers to start demanding the government to provide more land for development elsewhere in Macau. So the government began looking into the possibility of extending ZAP further into the Pearl River Delta. So they produced a number of plans, some of them showing enormous reclamation proposals and detailed layouts of street networks and in terms of the way they would fit in, the new area would fit into the rest of the Macau street network, and a more detailed proposal for the area that's approximately in the same region as where the NAP district is now. John Prescott also produced a master plan for this area, which apparently was sponsored by the Goodyear company. I don't know if that's related to the tire manufacturers, which was approximately, as I say, the area of NAP now, but seems to have been mostly cultural facilities. And another architecture office known as GMW International, I don't know who they are, proposed what they called the New Bridge neighborhood for a set of interconnected modernist slabs adjacent to the Lisboa Hotel. Now, in order to integrate or at least coordinate all of these different ideas, in 1982 the government announced international tenders for 4 areas in Macau. For San Malo, the Avenida de Almeida Ribeiro, Area Preta, the Outer Harbour, the NAP reclamation, and Praia Grande. Now, the first 3 tenders were won by Palmer & Turner, P&T Group, an architecture office based in Hong Kong, while the 4th was won by Manuel Vicente, who had by then returned to Macau. The tender for San Malo was all about heritage preservation and adaptive reuse of old buildings, because so many were being demolished due to the building boom. But the other 3 were for new areas on land that was yet to be reclaimed. About 10 teams were invited to make submissions for the new land adjacent to ZAP, titled NAP, the new areas of reclamation for the Outer Harbour, a development that was going to contain a mixture of residential, commercial, social, cultural, and leisure facilities. Third prize went to OBS Architects, the practice of Antonio Bruno Soares and Irene O. From 1978 to 1980, Bruno Soares had been working in the Department of Public Works, and OBS had been involved in the Heritage Committee. So their NAP plan attempts to reconcile the contradictions between heritage preservation and development. As well as references to the layout of historical Portuguese cities, the idea of the plan was to metaphorically mirror places in the Macau Peninsula in terms of street layout, public squares, building volumes, and so on, although in most cases they were expanded because, of course, the older areas had not been designed for automobiles. As well as an extension of the existing main road, the plan is designed around a main diagonal axis and a number of secondary axes with many green areas, including most of the waterfront. So the scale and the layout of the blocks was also adjusted to create view shafts, particularly to provide visibility of the fortress and the Aguia lighthouse on the mountains when arriving by sea. Second prize went to Manuel Vicente, working with Paulo San Marfil. And this project was also a response to the existing situation, a sampling of elements from the traditional urban fabric of Macau and elsewhere in an attempt to create variety and diversity. And with characteristic Vicente wit, and it must be said lack of subtlety, he spelt out Macau in the footprints of a cluster of buildings in a corner of the plan. These are the blueprints. And the idea was that the sloping roofs would allow them to be read from the street. First prize, as I mentioned, went to the P&T Group, leading an international team of consultants. The head architect of P&T was James Kinoshita, a Japanese-Canadian, but Eduardo Tavares convinced him to bring in Alvaro Siza as a design consultant. Siza was already an internationally noted architect. He was only 10 years away from winning the Pritzker Prize. So Tavares went to Portugal to convince Siza to come to Macau. And Siza agreed on the condition that he would be accompanied by his former professor, Fernando Távora, who was an expert on dealing with historical contexts. And then Siza added to his team the young Portuguese architects Antonio Madureira and Eduardo Soto de Moura, also a future Pritzker Prize winner. Now, this is the team that produced the design that was implemented, but it underwent such radical changes between 1982, the tender, and 1991, the finalized design, I think it can also be regarded as an example of unbuilt Macau, at least in its early stages. So Siza was focused on the new developments, the three new areas, the two main new areas, whereas Távora was focused on the heritage, on San Malo. But they engaged in productive discussions throughout. And in fact, the principles of Siza's large-scale urban plans were formulated based on the typological and morphological analyses of the existing small-scale situation carried out by Távora. So Siza made many visits to Macau, staying a few days each time, during which he made sketches of the city, attempting to identify the essential principles of the urban fabric and the topography. And while back in Portugal, he continued to draw from memory. Siza had become interested in Chinese designs and traditional Chinese paintings and traditional Chinese landscapes as expressions of the effects of human interventions in nature, such as terraced rice paddies. And during his visit to Macau, he also visited Hong Kong, where he decided that Hong Kong Island can easily accommodate far higher buildings than Macau because the mountain backdrop is correspondingly higher. So the sketch in this drawing you see in the top left, the upper mountainside is Hong Kong, the lower one is Macau. He said that the hills in Macau are too low for tall buildings, so he decided that height limits needed to be imposed on the new projects to avoid obscuring the hills. So the basic design was set during an initial brainstorming session with the entire team. And Siza proposed geometric platforms out on the water, separated from the existing city by canals to preserve the shape of the existing coastline. Now, Portuguese colonial cities are generally located on steep, rugged territory, and they incorporate existing natural elements, as does Macau. But Siza was being asked to design new urban areas on open, flat land. And on a recent trip to South America, he'd been very impressed with Spanish colonial cities built during the 16th century, which were typically set on open flat land, with detailed rules for the size of the street grid, invariably 144 meters square, and he believed that the scale of the Spanish grid had just the right balance of specificity versus neutrality to accommodate programmatic changes over the centuries. So Eduardo Tavares happened to have a copy of a newly published book on Spanish colonial cities, which he gave to Caesar to use as a reference. So Caesar's design proposed very, very wide boulevards, much wider than anything else in Macau. He tested the effects of clashes between the regular grid and the existing natural or artificial elements, giving rise to what he called small broadways, in reference to the way the orthogonal grid of Manhattan is affected by the diagonal line of Broadway. He also made studies of the balance between the street grid and the eclectic architecture it might be forced to contain. And in the words of Tavera, the force of form overcomes the uncertainties of program. Now, Area Preta, which is in the top right of this drawing, was next to an orthogonal grid expansion that had been carried out in the 1940s. So Caesar here developed a system of roads set on a 144-meter grid, with each building occupying a 120-meter square. The maximum site coverage was set at 75%, the maximum depth of the building volumes at 18 meters, thereby defining the minimum dimensions of the inner courtyards, of which 50% were to be green area, all accessible directly from the street. The original intention for Area Preta was to be an industrial district. In 1975, Eduardo Tavares had, on his own initiative, produced a model for reclamation and development in Area Preta, which he presented to the governor as an industrial and commercial center that would foster entrepreneurial activities. Then in 1978, he took the governor to visit Singapore, which he presented as a model or a precedent for what he envisaged. But when Area Preta was actually built, of course, almost all the buildings were converted to residential use because Stanley Ho still needed somewhere to resettle the squatters who were still occupying ZAP. Now, adjacent to the hotels and casinos at ZAP, Caesar proposed a rectangular grid, 144 by 60 meters, for blocks with chamfered corners, which he considered to be a better fit for the dimensions of the new land and the programmatic variety it would have to contain. And this also allowed the possibility of covering an entire block with a single building. The height limit of 22 meters was set by calculating the quantity of program that had to be placed upon it. And this too was to be built in phases. The ferry terminal, after many sketches, finally became a long platform projecting into the water between the two developments, oriented so that approaching ferries would have a view of the Gear Hill and the lighthouse. And between NAP and Area Preta, located where the ferry terminal is today, there was to be a small square containing luxury housing and a recreational marina next to it. And all of this was then presented or tested in terms of the effects it would have on the view of the hills. So when the finalized NAP plan was presented to the government in the summer of 1984, it met many protests from the public, harsh criticism from other architects. The scale was considered too large for Macau, in particular the very wide boulevards. The grid was considered too rigid and repetitive. It lacked the diversity of urban space purportedly appropriate to life in Macau. Manuel Vicente publicly condemned it as a Tibetan village. And in fact, many of the architects in P&T were also in agreement with these criticisms of Caesar's design. Nonetheless, the project was approved. The government awarded the tender for the first phase of reclamation in 1985, but immediately Stanley Ho complained that the two of his ZAP hotels, set adjacent to the two ends of what would become NAP, the Lisboa and what is now the Grand Lapa Hotel, would have their views blocked, and more importantly, would have their feng shui disrupted. So he demanded that both ends of the projected reclamation were sliced away, making it more or less square. The government initiated a review of the plan at a reduced size, which was submitted in 1987. The project was now being led by Campena Ferreira at P&T. He had arrived in 1984, and he arranged for the phasing of the project to allow the central square to be built first, as per Stanley Ho's requests. But Stanley Ho also wanted the ferry terminal relocated. It was also in the way. And this suddenly happened. The ferry terminal moved from where it is in this drawing to its new location just after a Portuguese politician visited Macau for a meeting with STDM. That same politician was then caught in Lisbon airport with a suitcase full of money he couldn't convincingly explain. Now, up until that time, land parcels in Nap were being sold at fixed prices, but after reclamation began, they were put to open auction, and immediately the prices expanded many times over. People started to make amazing profits on land that wasn't developed or hadn't even been built. And the Chinese company that was in charge of the reclamation had been given several plots to develop as partial compensation for their work, and they began to ask for changes to the rules. They firstly insisted that the new buildings were too low and to be commercially viable, with so few floors. And secondly, they asserted that Caesar's typology of perimeter slabs around street-level courtyards just wasn't appropriate for the local market, and they wanted to build a more usual typology of podiums containing shops and car parking with other functions in the towers above. In truth, they wanted all the regulations removed so they could just build whatever they liked. Now, the government saw the incredible investment potential of Nap, and they demanded that the architects, that P&T, find a solution for more floor area, and initiated a second review of the plan in 1989. Caesar was against the idea of increasing the height of the buildings, but Campina argued that it was the only way to save the essence of the original project, that is, the street grid and the main public spaces. So they started to revise the plan, with Campina focused on developing a new building typology, and Caesar focused on the public spaces. Now, although Nap was supposed to have comprised an entirely new architecture and urban typology for Macau, Campina's compromise was to tell the developers that the street grid would be kept, but the buildings would be allowed to follow the existing regulations. So the developers were still unhappy, but they no longer had any grounds for complaint. But this revealed the Achilles heel of Caesar's plan. The 24-meter wide boulevards, combined with the existing regulation for a 76-degree setback, permitted the buildings to rise as high as 80 meters. So Campina raised the courtyards from street level to the tops of three-story podiums, divided the perimeter buildings into two types, U-shaped residential slabs about 60 meters high and commercial tower blocks 80 meters high. Even this huge increase in floor area was not enough. On Christmas Eve 1990, Campina received a phone call from the government demanding that an entire extra row of buildings be added at the water's edge. He replied he wasn't going to act on the basis of a phone call, asked for a request in writing, and he was told that that would not be forthcoming, and he was being made an offer he couldn't refuse. So the next day, Campina wrote a letter setting out the changes as he understood them. He faxed it to the government and for confirmation. He faxed it to Caesar for approval. And the extra row of buildings, as you can see in this plan, was added along the waterfront, occupying a wide strip that Caesar had allocated for a waterfront park. And the entire street grid was slid to the north, narrowing the canal between Nap and Zap from 80 meters to 12 meters. Caesar was furious. The relationship with the government was destroyed, but contrary to rumors, he never quit the project. The final plan was submitted in 1991. This is the document, gazetted in the Bulletin Official, the official bulletin. And it's explained in great detail the residential blocks, the office towers, the commercial podiums, and the green areas, and in fact included a new green area, this time on the east side of the development. Now, to explain why it was published and why, as you can see very clearly, it's returned from the square shape to the original full rectangular shape, I have to go back to 1982 and talk about the fourth tender for Praia Grande. So, in 1975, Eduardo Tavares, again, had made a proposal to develop the length of Praia Grande between the Boa Vista Hotel and the Lisboa Hotel, lining the waterfront with cafes and boutiques, enclosing the bay to create a new lake with a tropical garden sloping down to the water, which will contain artificial islands. Now, the 1982 tender request asked for the creation of a new freshwater lake. P&T did a very simple version with a curving breakwater. Caesar made some sketches with a very direct straight line going from Nap across the bay. But Manuel Vicente's proposal, which was done in tandem with the proposal for the Nap area, used much more complex curvilinear geometries and in many areas allocated areas for buildings. So this is his submission from 1983, where you can see he made very, very detailed, beyond planning, almost to the level of architectural design for these areas. There was the larger plan and the model. Now, over the following years, there were several changes of governor, which led to the cancellation of the entire Praia Grande plan. But the sudden increase in land prices in Nap and elsewhere in the late 1980s caused a renewed interest in increasing the size of Nap and developing Praia Grande. Stanley Ho in particular was demanding more land for SDM to develop. Then following a certain event that took place in a certain public square in the capital city of China in 1989, the Macau governor was the first person to visit Beijing and pay his respects to the Chinese government, and in return was given the right to build an airport and to expand the part of Praia Grande adjacent to Nap. So a new tender was opened for Praia Grande Bay, and it was won by P&T. The competition results were published in the newspaper. Then a few days later, the project was suddenly reassigned to Manuel Vicente, who, as it happens, was being sponsored by Stanley Ho. So STDM was given the rights to the new land at Praia Grande, and when that happened, the feng shui problems at Nap miraculously disappeared. Ho said that Nap could revert to its full area, provided that STDM were given the rights to that extra land. But at the west edge, this caused some more problems because there was a conflict between Vicente and Caesar. For Caesar, the additional area of Nap was still part of his original Nap plan and should follow the street grid. But for Vicente, it was a new extension that should be under his jurisdiction. So Vicente made several proposals for new and different block and street layouts, which he collaged onto the existing plan and the existing aerial photos. But finally, the government stepped in and announced that the ZAP platform was entirely under Caesar and P&T's control. So Vicente tried to follow the grid and then finally accepted that that area would all follow the P&T plan. A public now the Vicente plan for Praia Grande was then published in the official bulletin in 1992, making it publicly under the control of STDM. But as a pretext to make this seem part of a general government strategy and not favoritism for a particular individual, the NAP plan and the Area Preta plan were published in the bulletin at exactly the same time. A private entity called the Nam Van Lakes Corporation was established in order to administer development in Praia Grande. But nonetheless, the area languished, and many of the plots are still empty today. In 2003, Vicente was asked again to revise the plan. He was now working together with Rui Liao and Carlotta Bruni as VLB. They produced the Nam Van Square, adjacent to Macau Tower, designed by the New Zealand architect Gordon Moller, and then followed by a proposal for an urban park adjacent to the third bridge, and an unbuilt proposal for a dragon boat viewing stand. Now, during the 1990s, Eduardo Tavares had worked with Peter Cookson Smith of Urbis in Hong Kong to make optimistic proposals for the areas adjacent to these big developments, including a marina proposal beside Nap and a festival market on the other end of Praia Grande. But in 2001, these didn't happen, of course, they remain unbuilt. In 2001, the government decided that Stanley Ho's casino monopoly would not be renewed and that bidding for the gaming concessions would be open to international corporations. So in 2002, licenses were issued to Las Vegas Sands, MGM, and Wynn, and the remaining open areas in Nap were proposed as the best locations for the new casinos. In 2002, Sheldon Adelson, the chairman of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, visited Macau together with the Las Vegas architect Paul Steelman, and they looked at the triangle of open water, which you see on the right-hand side of this photo, as a possible location for a casino. Adelson told Steelman he wanted a casino there within a year. Now, Steelman was a little slow. He did the design in 1 week, together with his colleague Steve Anderson, but it was a full 16 months before the Sands Macau opened. Sitting on piles, in fact, but contiguous with the reclaimed land of Nap. On the west side of Nap, STDM had built some placeholder sheds following the Caesar street grid, but in 2004, these 12 lots were combined into 2 huge lots, one occupied by MGM under the control of Stanley Ho's daughter Pansy, and the other sold by STDM to Steve Wynn for $900 million. So over the next few years, the NAP master plan was overridden by the Wynn, MGM, Starworld, and Lark casinos. Following public outcry, the government simply repealed the master plan. And then finally, the canal that divided NAP and ZAP was refilled and turned into a public park called the Garden of Arts. The other major reclamation project that was begun in the 1990s was Cotai. 6 square kilometers of reclaimed land that turned the islands of Taipa, well, Taipa was originally 2 islands, Big Taipa and Little Taipa, and Koloan into a single landmass. The islands had first been physically connected in 1968 by a 2-kilometer long causeway called the Isthmus Road. And this is the situation in 86. In 1989, Eduardo Tavares again invited Campina and P&T Group to plan a landfill between Taipa and Koloan that included what he called MIT, the Macau Institute of Technology, which was a precursor for MUST, the Macau University of Science and Technology. Nothing came of this plan, but in 1992, the government announced a tender to find a team to plan a new town for 150,000 people in the Cotai area. Second place in the competition went to Manuel Vicente, but the winner was a team led by Eduardo Lima Soares, which included his former employer, John Prescott, and the engineers, Asia Consult. In fact, Prescott was the main driver of the design. All the drawings were done at his office, and they were coordinated by his staff member, Mario Neves. So after an initial presentation to the government and some substantial revisions, the final design was submitted in 1994. Now, the model shows mainly podium tower typologies with all the public parking located underground. To the east is an infrastructural zone, which incorporates the airport that was then under construction, a projected new passenger ferry terminal, and a container port. A strip of parkland separates this from the central zone, which contains some relatively large buildings, volumes for housing and retail. To the north are some smaller building volumes and another green area adjoining Taipa. And it also included the suggestion of renovating 5 early 20th century houses on Taipa's Avenida de Praia, which was in fact completed in 1999 to the design of Maria José de Freitas. To the west, adjoining the Lotus Flower Bridge that links, or adjacent to the Lotus Flower Bridge that links Cotai to Hanshin Island, there was a tourist complex named Mega City, which contained a hotel, a convention hall, a theater, a swimming pool, golf, tennis, and an artificial ski slope. This, of course, was never built. The Macau airport was opened in 1995, for which the Portuguese President Mario Soares made an official visit to Macau. While he was there, Stanley Ho presented him with his own, a scale model of his own proposal for the Cotai area, which would turn it into a leisure zone containing 10 hotels, an exhibition center, and a theme park. Nonetheless, the Lima Soares plan continued to be endorsed and supported by the government, and in fact exhibited in a major exhibition in 1998, showing the future of Macau immediately before the handover in 1999. But just after the handover, the government began to think about the possibility of turning Cotai into a casino resort area. In July 2001, Au Mun Long, Secretary for Transport and Public Works, who's now incarcerated for corruption, announced a revision of the Cotai master plan by the architects Eddie Wong and Luis Sa Machado, working together with Asia Consult. So the revised plan was completed in 6 months, and similar to the transformation of NAP to allow MGM and Wynn casinos, Eduardo Lima Soares' main arteries were kept, but some of the secondary roads were erased in order to create larger lots for integrated resorts. The housing was all removed, and the planned hospital relocated to Koloan. The government showed this new plan to the international gaming corporations, and then in 2002, after deciding on the location of the Sands Casino in Nap, Sheldon Adelson came to Cotai and in an epiphany similar to that of Bugsy Siegel's vision of a gambling paradise in the empty Nevada desert, he imagined a magnificent avenue lined with luxury hotels and casinos that would be known as the Cotai Strip. So Adelson commissioned the US architects Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill to produce a master plan in collaboration with the landscape architecture firm EDAW. In 2005, EDAW was purchased by AECOM, and they've disappeared or merged fully into AECOM. And locally, the work was coordinated by Campina, again at MPS. MPS was a company he had co-founded in 1998. The emphasis was on the provision of outdoor public space, low density, and movement along the strip based on the mistaken assumption that most visitors would enjoy walking along the strip, which was to have contained three major public spaces: a water park, a tropical garden, and a Grand Falls. The Grand Falls was a venue for street performances. Unfortunately, these ideas were never implemented. And finally, in the master plan as finalized just before construction began, it was only the Venetian casino that followed the regulations that had been created by MPS. In any case, just as the Cotai reclamation was being completed and the Cotai Strip was beginning to take shape, Eduardo Tavares proposed a World Cultural Forum on an enormous strip of new land just to the north end of the east edge of the reservoir across from Nap. There's the location plan superimposed on a satellite photo. This was to be a site for a World Expo, for cultural exchange, and so forth. And I think that this is really it's a very schematic plan, but it's also what I think can be described as a utopian diagram of East meeting West, and a deeply optimistic statement about what Macau could and should be, but it of course remains unbuilt. Now I want to conclude with an example of the kind of thinking that might have been possible in Macau, and might still be possible in Macau. In the mid-1990s, at the same time as Nap was being built and Cotai was being conceived, the Japanese architect Arata Isozaki was commissioned by the Zhuhai municipal government to produce a master plan that would turn the southern part of Hanshin Island into a center for international exchange. But after visiting the site, Isozaki instead decided to propose an offshore island, an offshore city on a new island, which he said could be seen as, quote, utopia because a city on the sea evokes a world totally detached from contemporary political institutions and social conventions, end quote. Isozaki titled his project Mirage City, and his intention was to avoid a rigid master plan, to use a process of layering in which each successive intervention reinforces or dilutes the previous ones. So urban form becomes a kind of interference pattern. The initial basic elliptical form and axes of the island were established using feng shui principles. The connection with the coastline of Hanshin Island uses two bridges in the same configuration as shown in the frontispiece of Thomas More's 16th century book Utopia, the book in which the word first appears. The layout of the Forbidden City in Beijing was superimposed to create a north-south axis for a central business district. The Grand Canal of Venice was used as inspiration for a canal that would cross the master plan. Isozaki, this is the early 90s or mid-90s, Isozaki also was playing with some early parametric computer software to create a web of vectors that would provide a layout of streets and plazas. And in another example, using a genetic algorithm to create a pattern of building density for public space and building volumes. His architectural prototypes drew on principles and patterns he found in China, using traditional courtyard typologies, circular courtyards, rectangular courtyards, and even houseboats. So through this process, Isozaki had developed a basic master plan, but then he tried to complicate or attenuate his own authorship. He, first of all, superimposed Piranesi's famous Campo Marzio of ancient Rome, drawn in the 18th century, on the island to subdivide it into lots. And each of these lots was given to one of 48 international architects who all provided their own projects to place onto the island. Then he organized an exhibition of the project in Tokyo, in which visitors to the exhibition were invited to modify the model right there in the gallery. And 12 other guest architects and artists were asked to provide their own master plans, working directly in the gallery on duplicates of the main model. Needless to say, this was never built. It does appear in the independently published 21st Century Macau City Planning Guideline Study, where you can see it down at the bottom of Hanshin Island, together with some incredible proposals for reclamations that link Macau to Cotai. Various other people have looked at the area south of Hanshin Island. I know nothing about this project except that if you Google this topic, this is what you find. Designed by a company called the China Communications Construction Company. But the competition for this area was finally held and won in 2015 by the Australian Architecture Office, Hassel, who have proposed a set of interconnected islands totaling 17 square kilometers, for which the underlying planning principle is that nowhere in this development is more than 5 minutes walk away from the waterfront. So the reclamation, this is underway, the reclamation will happen over the next few years and the plan will be built incrementally. Now I think that in a sense, all urban planning is utopian in intention. To design without believing you're improving the world in some small way would be unbearably cynical. And I believe that Macau is small enough and rich enough to become a testing ground for radically utopian urban proposals. Macau, built and unbuilt, could become a model for the world. Now, this research, which began before I received the fellowship and has continued since the fellowship officially ended, has contributed to the content of a chapter I wrote for a book edited by the University of Pennsylvania professor Stefan Ahl. I'd already written a draft before I began the fellowship, but the research allowed me to substantially revise it, to correct errors, and add new information. So the essay is not the conclusion of the research, it's a preamble that I hope will lead to a collaborative effort with other scholars, editors, and curators. The book itself is called Macau and the Casino Complex. It was published about 1 month ago, and I was amused to see that the cover design accidentally references Manuel Vicente's unbuilt towers for the Nap area, spelling out Macau. Thank you very much.